teeming, humid sprawl of the Piazza di Santa Croce, where the stench of human bodies mixed with stale sewage and boiling mineral salts. Life clung to existence by a single sticky thread. This was not merely a place of hygiene, it was a nexus of desperation, where the desperate poor sought cleansing from physical filth, while the wealthy hoped for spiritual stain removal. Steam rose in thick, choking plumes, an aromatic curtain concealing both dubious rituals and genuine grime. For generations, this municipal bathhouse had served its purpose, to wash away the day's muck. But as time wore on, the line between routine sanitation and profound ceremony blurred into nothingness. The air itself seemed saturated with a strange mix of boiled herbs and unwashed sin. Every transaction within these damp stone walls was imbued with gravity, a sense that what you lost here, or even failed to clean completely, would haunt your afterlife. It was a crucible where biology met belief, where the mundane act of scrubbing skin became an elaborate performance for unseen powers. A nobleman, draped in silks too fine for such a setting, entered the humid mist with an air of calculated nonchalance. His passage through the crowded bathhouse felt less like transit and more like participation in some silent, high-stakes drama. He moved past steaming vents that hissed steam over worn flagstones, his attention fixed not on scrubbing away sweat, but on making a statement. With a slow, deliberate gesture, he unclasped a tunic, its linen dyed a respectable cream color, though beneath the surface grime of the city, it was stained with life's accumulation, sweat, market dust, and the subtle yellowing patina of old sins. He did not discard it carelessly. No, he let it fall softly near the edge of a massive steam vent, letting the warm vapor claim the fabric as if it were some ritual offering to the damp earth itself. The bathhouse attendants, seasoned observers in the chaotic theater of sin and purification, did not flinch at the display. They merely slowed their work, pausing with hands slicked with scented soaps. Their eyes, sharp and knowing, catalogued the action. They understood immediately that this was no random act of carelessness. This gesture was a deliberate communication, a sacrifice offered to whatever damp, unseen force governed the city's passage into decay. Was it an attempt at desperate piety, acknowledging the pervasive uncleanliness of existence? Or was it something far darker, a subtle, insulting blasphemy, asserting a claim over the very sources of purification? The act hung in the thick steam, momentarily arresting the normal flow of humanity, setting the stage for the slow, inevitable drama of communal purification to unfold that day. The early hours passed in this charged tension, weaving themselves into the heavy tapestry of the city's collective anxiety. The bathing ritual became an intellectual exercise as much as a physical one. To wash was to engage with belief systems centuries deep, a system where bodily fluids and runoff water were never merely waste, but potential conduits for spiritual power or contamination. Every drain, every pool of steam condensate carried symbolic weight. To ignore these currents was to risk divine displeasure. The stain on the nobleman's tunic echoed throughout the day, a subtle narrative thread hinting at underlying desperation. Meanwhile, the general populace, caught in the web of seasonal anxieties and creeping disease, sought refuge in this manufactured sanctity. They bathed not just to feel clean, but to appear clean, a defense mechanism against both literal filth and spiritual damnation. The bathhouse was a microcosm of medieval fear. Here, sin required physical removal. Here, death demanded ritual cleansing. And here, the line between the two dissolved into boiling steam as the brilliant heat of midday began its slow, weary descent toward evening. The crowded bustle of the piazza finally started to thin. The earlier frenzy, the frantic scrubbings and desperate piety seen among the wealthy, had given way to a more subdued rhythm. Yet, an undercurrent of anxiety persisted in the cool, damp air that clung perpetually near the drains and steam vents. It was the air of deep worry, a common companion during times of illness or impending loss. It was this changing light that drew together a different kind of patron. Near the main exit, away from the opulent tiling reserved for the nobles, a smaller, more somber group began to congregate. These were not people seeking mere hygiene. They were pauper families, their garments drab with dust, and where their faces etched deep with the unmistakable gravity of grief. For them, the bathhouse was not a place of cleansing. It was a location charged by proximity to death. The air here tasted metallic, tinged faintly with bile and chalky runoff. The drained stone floors near the exit were slick, reflecting the dwindling light in pools of questionable liquid. And into these puddles, this discarded wash water, the grieving families began their strange ritual. They did not merely watch, they acted with a focused desperation. With cupped hands and repurposed vessels, small, sealed ceramic jugs, often borrowed or scavenged, they scooped up the runoff water. This wasn't just ordinary sewage residue mixed with bath soap and sweat. To those performing this bizarre rite, this discarded life water held potent significance, a residual energy left behind by the millions of fleeting touches, the hurried scrubs, and the profound acts of washing away sin. It was water that had passed over thresholds, between life and death, between sin and supposed grace. The atmosphere hardened around them as figures of authority began to whisper cautionary warnings. A priest, his robes looking too clean for this place of soiled ritual, approached the group. His voice, when it finally pierced the damp afternoon stillness, was low, but carrying an edge of profound terror. He didn't rail against their actions. He merely warned of consequences. He gestured toward the jugs filled with the effluent, his eyes wide and fearful. He cautioned them that this contaminated water, gathered from the filthiest parts of the bathhouse floor, the runoff from those who had washed away plagues, or whose desperate piety had been mistaken for blasphemy, would not cleanse. On the contrary, he warned that by collecting it, they were marking their own souls. He painted a terrifying picture. This collection was an entanglement with lingering spiritual dirt, suggesting eternal regret and some form of cosmic accounting for every drop they stole from the drain. The fear surrounding death in this medieval city was not merely an emotional state. It was a palpable physical force that dictated daily life. And if death was viewed as a messy business, a collection of bodily fluids, soiled linens, and lingering spiritual residue, then the boundary between life-affirming purity and damning pollution became dangerously porous. The bathhouse, constantly oscillating between these two states, became the perfect nexus for such ritual confusion. For the poor families, poverty had stripped away their ability to distinguish sacred from profane. If the priest warned that water held judgment, then this collected sludge, this stream of washed-away existence, became a necessary component in appeasing whatever supernatural entity waited beyond the veil. It was a desperate attempt to siphon off some semblance of control over an afterlife they feared was utterly chaotic and indiscriminately cruel. The whispers intensified as dusk gathered its deep indigo cloak over the stone arcade. The water, collected and sealed away, seemed to absorb the encroaching gloom. It was less liquid than ritualistic pollutant. It felt weighted with expectation, a sort of captured spiritual exhaust. They believed that if they could hoard enough of this residue, this confluence of bodily waste and sacramental intention, they might somehow buffer their souls against the judgment reserved for those unprepared or sinful upon passing. As the frantic activity of the afternoon died down, yielding to the heavy cloak of twilight, a different kind of energy permeated the steam-slicked stone halls. The main bath area, which had pulsed with the desperate clamor of cleansing and dread, began to quiet. The wealthy patrons had departed, their desperation temporarily satisfied by expensive soaps and hurried anonymity. The poor families, having collected their contaminated runoff, had slipped away into the growing darkness. Now only ghosts seemed permitted to linger, suspended in the thick steam that hung like a shroud. A figure materialized among the cavernous arches, a bathhouse porter, whose years seemed etched into his deep-set eyes and calloused hands. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of someone who had seen too many dawns rise over human folly. His reputation preceded him, whispered in hushed tones from one corner to another. He claimed descent not merely from porters, but from the ancient Roman diviners themselves. In this telling, his task was far more profound than scrubbing grime from bodies. It was a navigation of spiritual currents. As dusk deepened and the gas lamps cast elongated, sickly yellow beams across the damp flagstones, The porter moved toward the perimeter chambers, 3 specific steam rooms tucked away in the deep recesses of the building. These chambers were rarely used, designated only for high-ranking cleansing rituals that demanded extreme privacy. Yet tonight, he treated them with a reverence far surpassing mere cleanliness. With practiced efficiency, he secured the heavy wooden doors and thick iron latches, locking out any stray curiosity or unintended visitor. He did not prepare these chambers for the simple act of bathing. Instead, they became his altar, and the steam itself his medium. The porter began to murmur. His voice was a low rasp, barely audible above the hiss of condensing water, yet it carried an unnerving resonance that seemed to vibrate against the damp bones of the building itself. These were not pleas for purification. These were incantations, ancient words drawn from forgotten languages, sounds meant not for appeasing local gods, but for negotiating with entities far deeper in the abyss. The wet stone surfaces became receptive to his rhythm. His hands, stained and weathered by decades of soap and sin, traced symbols into the floor tiles, marks that were certainly not standard bathhouse graffiti. They formed patterns, interlocking spirals meant to confuse passage, and geometric knots designed to bind or release unseen forces. Each murmured syllable seemed to consecrate these markings, transforming simple, mundane architecture into a nexus point of occult activity. He was preparing them not for scrubbers, nor even merely penitents. He was preparing gateways. The ritual atmosphere was thick with the scent of wet plaster, and something else, something acrid and earthy, like crushed graveyard lilies, mingled with mineral salts. This blend of potent smells served to heighten the senses, pulling any remaining observer into a state of heightened disorientation, making it difficult to discern where the physical realm ended and the supernatural began. The locked chambers stood as silent witnesses to this secretive gathering of occult power. The porter worked methodically, treating the condensation drips not as natural runoff, but as ritualistic offerings. He seemed obsessed with controlling the flow to harness the steam at precise points, thereby manipulating the passage of time, and perhaps, more dangerously, the boundaries between life and death itself. The bathhouse, designed for ultimate temporary cleansing, was being repurposed into a highly specialized, clandestine portal. Every drip, every whiff of scented oil meant to mask foul odors, every locked door, now spoke of a purpose far darker than simple hygiene. The nightly ritual was not about purification. It was about negotiation, ensuring that whatever collected the souls in the dark times understood the price and knew which doors, and indeed, which lives, were accessible after the steam cleared. The city air, already thick with the scent of unwashed bodies and stale steam from earlier hours, was suddenly laced with a new odor, a metallic tang, sharp and alarming. The whispers that had circulated among the panicked crowds for days finally coalesced into something undeniable: sickness. It arrived not as a rumor whispered over hearth fires, but as a physical terror spreading through the narrow streets. When the plague began its brutal work, it stripped away civilized order, dissolving religious dogma and social etiquette alike. In the face of an indiscriminate death like this, men did not look for solace in scripture alone. They sought control, any semblance of mastery over the inevitable void. The bathhouse, always a place of liminality, suddenly acquired immense importance. It became less a center of sanitation and more a potential checkpoint between worlds. The usual flow of lifeblood through its steam vents was now viewed as a contested resource, one that might purify or perhaps merely confuse the departed spirit before it crossed over. A profound panic settled over the community, curdling piety into desperation. And into this fertile ground of fear and biological dread stepped the wealthy, the powerful figures whose lives were built upon illusion and authority. One such figure, shrouded in rich wool that seemed outrageously clean even amidst the grime, moved through the steam-fogged atrium. He was not there to indulge in cleansing. His demeanor spoke of calculation, of immense worry regarding secrets, rather than mere physical impurities. His movements were urgent, radiating a desperate energy that contrasted sharply with the placid ritualism surrounding him. He did not approach the communal tubs. Instead, he cornered the aging porter near the deepest steam chambers, the very places that had been secretly marked and consecrated hours before for some unknown rite. This man, whose lineage seemed to connect him directly to the subterranean murmurs of ancient times, was clearly an intermediary in matters far beyond public knowledge. The powerful man bypassed any polite negotiation. He needed access, not purification. He demanded private quarters, secluded rooms, where the heat and steam could be contained and redirected for a specific purpose. The porter regarded him with eyes that had seen too much passing through those stone tunnels. Yet the sheer weight of authority pressing down on him forced a cornering agreement. A frantic pact was struck in the damp, echoing chamber in exchange for safe passage and controlled access to what he identified only as purified water, a phrase dripping with ominous suggestion. The noble figure agreed to absolute silence. His knowledge demanded it. His status required it. The implications of this bargain were vast. The sanctity of the bathhouse rituals, whatever they truly involved, would be exchanged for nothing more than temporary physical safety and a reprieve from total chaos. The agreement set the stage for a new kind of ritual misuse. If the rites held power over the dead, then the state itself had placed a valuable commodity on the table: their silence. The lines between sacred function and illicit negotiation blurred into an oily, dangerous indistinction. Everyone who entered after that point, the frantic families, The passing guards, even those merely seeking respite from the heat, did so with the awareness of these unseen transactions occurring just beneath the surface steam. The bathhouse had become a theater for forced bargains. It was no longer solely about washing away sin. It was about buying immunity from death. The very water that was supposed to cleanse was instead treated as a negotiable asset, capable of sealing pacts and silencing truths. The scent of desperation mixed with sulfurous steam, creating an atmosphere thick enough to choke on a breathable haze of irreversible commitments under the sickly glow of tallow lamps. The steam that permeated the central baths was not merely a byproduct of hot water. It seemed to carry an oppressive weight, a visible burden of sin and lingering dread. This was no place of comfortable cleansing. It was a theater for desperation. The purpose of this final ritual baptism for the undead was shrouded in desperate theatricality. Here, under the haze, were brought those deemed unclean by any measure, the destitute whose poverty marked them as spiritually tainted, the accused, whose questionable loyalties left their souls unwritten, and even, most disturbing to observe, the recently deceased. Their bodies had escaped proper rites, awaiting a fate that history could not record. They entered the warm steam not with dignity, but with a profound, almost grotesque confusion. The process was meticulously orchestrated by those who claimed to hold the keys to eternal passage. Instead of simple soap and water, they were submerged in mixtures that spoke of exotic desperation. Thick, perfumed oils mixed unnervingly with river silt gathered from polluted sources upstream. This mixture did more than cleanse. It obscured. It muted the defining characteristics of life or death, turning these participants into confused, wet apparitions drifting aimlessly through the steaming depths. The scent was overwhelming, a cloying blend of jasmine meant to mask, musk intended to appease, and the mineral tang of decay mixed with raw river mud. It created an illusion of spiritual transition, a false dawn painted over the reality of desperation. To look upon them was to feel that very boundary between worlds had become hopelessly blurred. This wasn't cleansing, it was disguising. If the ritual was to confuse, then the most effective challenge would be one of cold, impartial logic. Chapter 6 introduced a figure determined not by faith or desperation, but by verifiable fact, an investigator, perhaps a skeptic alchemist, whose tools were samples and reagents rather than incantations. He arrived in the echoing, humid chambers after the fever pitch of desperate rites, moving with meticulous disdain through the steam-stained grime. The atmosphere shifted from one of terrified reverence to one of clinical scrutiny. The heat still clung thickly to the air, a residual miasma carrying the ghosts of oils, silt, and fear. But the focus was now on the architecture of deception itself. Our investigator did not worship the vents or kneel before the pools. He analyzed them, his attention snagged first on the vast network of drainage systems, the very veins of the bathhouse that handled every passing sin and bodily effusion. He knelt by a drain sluice, gathering small cups of runoff water that had seeped through the flagstones. This was not merely waste. In the eyes of the believers, it was life water, touched by ritual cleansing, or tainted by the indignity of plague. Yet, to him, it was simply effluent. He labeled samples: drain runoff, condensate residue, main reservoir sample. The process became a slow, deliberate deconstruction of supposed mystery. With specialized glassware and small burners, he began mixing these liquids with common reagents, acids, bases, mineral salts that were mundane in the alchemist's cabinet, but profoundly disruptive to the ritualists who believed they dealt with divine or infernal chemistry. The steam itself, once a perceived conduit for supernatural power, became merely atmospheric vapor, identifiable by its differing density and temperature gradients. The condensation dripping from the overhead pipes was tested. It proved chemically similar to ambient moisture, albeit mineral-rich. This scientific approach stripped away layers of superstitious meaning. Where priests claimed that mixing certain runoff sources would appease underworld rivers or guide a soul across the Styx, the alchemist merely observed a predictable chemical reaction. He noted how impurities in the local stonework, leaching into the perpetually damp stone, contributed minerals detectable on a basic spectrum analysis, minerals with no known connection to the passage of souls. The central bath reservoirs themselves were treated with the same detached professionalism. They held enough water for multiple cleansings, and when he tested them, he found variations not in their spiritual potency, but in their source composition, some receiving indirect drainage from city cisterns, others perhaps carrying residual oils and fats left over from the highly ritualized ablutions. He moved among the vats that had hosted the marginalized and the recently deceased. He wasn't judging the rituals, he was cataloging the liquid media. Were these scented oils mixed with river silt for symbolic camouflage? Perhaps, but beneath the perfumed facade, he could detect trace elements, industrial dyes, foreign soaps, materials indicating a highly practiced theatrical show of piety and mystery. The accumulated samples were not just bottles of water. They represented failed belief structures. Each liquid was potential evidence, proving that the sacred boundaries perceived by the community were merely complex mixtures of plumbing issues, bacterial runoff, and human gullibility. This relentless questioning laid a foundation of doubt, far more destructive than any physical blow. It suggested that the deepest held fears, the necessity of specialized cleansing for transitional states between life and death, could be reduced to mere chemistry. The implication hung heavy in the humid air. If water could be reduced to understandable chemical formulas, then perhaps the supposed power inherent in specific ritualistic baths could similarly be categorized, contained, and neutralized. The stage was set for a reckoning where evidence would finally trump ancient dread. The cycle of life, death, and questionable hygiene continued unabated within the steam-filled walls. If mere scrubbing was a social event, then interacting with the boundary between worlds was an industrial operation of baffling complexity. As the ritualistic activity in the bathhouses had taken its toll, the most solemn commodity to pass through the chambers were not living bodies, but those freshly departed. Here, the usual rites of burial seemed utterly inadequate, or perhaps more accurately, simply out of sync with the esoteric needs of the locale. A procession began to gather, silent and somber, under the weak glow filtering down from oiled tallow lamps. The air, already thick with minerals, sweat, and exotic bath oils, acquired a sharper, coppery scent, the unmistakable perfume of death itself. Here, in Chapter 7, the physical act of cleansing met the spectral requirements of passage. The conventional undertakers, who understood the quiet dignity of fresh earth, were suddenly finding their traditions challenged by a far more complex mythology operating within these humid walls. The coffins arrived, carried with meticulous care, treated not as vessels for rest, but perhaps as containers for pending transfer. They were brought into the deepest recesses of the bathhouse grounds, areas traditionally reserved for communal scrubbing and washing away of days' impurities only moments before formal burial could begin. These deceased bodies faced a baffling second cleansing, an exposure to the raw steam and wet heat of the operational bathhouse itself. It was an anticlimactic confrontation between mortality and mundane sanitation. Instead of being swiftly moved towards the outer graveyards, the shrouded remains were held captive within the steamy confines. They were momentarily subjected to blasts of hot vapor, a literal immersion in the lingering energy fields of human activity. This process was bafflingly prolonged for rites that demanded speed and solemnity. It seemed less an act of purification and more a confusing delay, designed to disorient both the living mourners and, perhaps more importantly, whatever entity waited on the other side. The man leading this ceremony, the undertaker, or maybe a specially designated ritual attendant, did not follow the comforting rhythm of established funeral rites. His motions were jerky, imbued with an almost frantic urgency. He seemed far less concerned with ensuring a respectful transition for the dead than with controlling the narrative, and indeed, the physical path between life and death itself. Every movement appeared aimed at confusing the perceived geography of passage, suggesting that merely getting from one side of the threshold to another was fraught with dangerous ritualistic requirements. It wasn't enough to simply bury them beneath consecrated ground. They had to be washed through a nexus point, forced into temporary proximity with the sheer force of living human sin and desperate survival. These dead bodies became props in a grand, unsettling play about what it truly meant to cease existing within a community that equated contamination with damnation. The steaming water seemed not to cleanse, but rather to suspend. It held them, making their transition feel less like a dignified passage into eternal rest, and more like being briefly trapped in an overly dramatic holding tank of spiritual limbo. This moment crystallized the central delusion that earthly sanitation could somehow dictate or even control the unknowable mechanisms governing the soul's fate after life. The procession continued through the humid, overheated facility. Some officials observed with bewildered fascination, while others, those who understood the secret protocols, maintained a focused, almost sinister vigilance over the proceedings. The focus was not on reverence. It was on procedural complexity. To pass the dead through these baths meant accepting that death itself required a highly convoluted, man-made ritual itinerary, forcing both the living and the recently departed into an unnatural state of temporary confluence. It was, in essence, a deliberate architectural confusing of metaphysical lines. They were being scrubbed not for physical cleanliness, but for ritualistic confusion, perhaps to ensure that the soul did not simply slip through, uncatalogued, or perhaps to delay passage until the authorities felt sufficiently comfortable claiming jurisdiction over even the afterlife. The steam, carrying its heavy scent of minerals and damp stone, seemed to whisper a single truth, that in this place nothing, not sin, nor life, nor death itself, was ever truly clean, merely temporarily saturated with obligation. For days, the bathhouse had functioned as an island of desperate performance art, a stage where sin, plague, and the afterlife were mixed into one steaming cauldron. The great lie, the notion that mere water could sanitize the passage from life to death, had become dangerously seductive. The powerful noble, whose pact for purified water earlier in the narrative was built upon fear and secrecy, now sought to cement his control over this fragile boundary. He planned a final rite, an attempt to reassert human will against the uncontrollable forces that supposedly governed the cycle of passing. He intended to finalize the ritual, ensuring that the steam vents, the pools of runoff, and even the very architecture functioned only under the auspices of his authority. His preparation was meticulous, arrogant in its certainty. He commanded acolytes to array themselves around the central cistern, positioning scented oils and ritual tools as if directing a grand operatic scene. The air grew thick not just with steam, but with forced reverence, a pressure built by wealth attempting to bottle divine sanction. They prepared for a moment of ultimate revelation, designed to confirm his power, that the rites had been completed, that the threshold was closed off and controlled. But human hubris, particularly when intertwined with desperation, is prone to catastrophic failure. The fragile edifice of belief could not withstand random disruption. It needed nothing more than an unpredictable element, a burst of chaos, to expose the charade entirely. The attempt at a grand finale began smoothly enough, cloaked in the heavy fog and scent of exotic resins. The noble addressed the assembled participants with gestures dripping with authority, speaking of divine favor and transactional piety. He demanded obedience to the new ritual structure, painting over previous inconsistencies with an impenetrable sheen of imposed order. Yet, the city's underlying chaos was deeper than any decree or pact could contain. It waited in the shadows, the pockets of grime, the forgotten corners where true filth accumulated beneath the veneer of ceremonial cleansing. Suddenly, a discordant sound ripped through the oppressive atmosphere, the drunken stumble of a marginalized citizen. This individual, perhaps having consumed too much cheap liquor, or simply being an embodiment of uncontrollable messiness, entered the steam chamber without invitation. His unpredictable movement sent ripples across the still water and, crucially, struck something vital in the system's delicate balance. It was not merely a stumble. It was a physical disruption that translated instantly into symbolic ruin. The impact jostled the primary steam regulator, a mechanism designed to maintain the theatrical mist, causing a sudden, violent surge of pressure. This burst of rogue steam did more than just fill the chamber. It dislodged years of secreted concealment. With a startling hiss and crackle, it revealed portions of the structure that had been carefully forgotten or deliberately erased from public knowledge. Forbidden markings carved deep into the slick, wet tile walls. These symbols were not mere decorative graffiti. They were ancient glyphs, complex arrangements of angles and lines that spoke not to local piety, but to something far older, far less accommodating. The revelatory nature of these carvings struck everyone present like a physical blow. The grand pronouncements of the noble dissolved into meaningless noise before the stark reality etched into the stone. The markings contradicted every known understanding of municipal hygiene, or even recognized religious iconography. They suggested not merely passage through cleansing water, but negotiation with entities that existed outside the purview of both church doctrine and civic authority. The failed ritual plunged the bathhouse into an instant state of profound confusion. Authority vanished in a wash of steam-driven panic. The noble's carefully constructed charisma proved utterly inadequate when confronted by undeniable physical evidence of deeper forces at play. His practiced piety held no defense against forgotten secrets rendered suddenly visible and exposed to the profane air. This moment of revelation shattered the established order, leaving behind not purification, but a raw, terrifying void of unknowing. The stage was ripped open, revealing the messy truth underneath the ritualistic steam. That their attempts to control death were simply inadequate parlor tricks when confronted by genuine supernatural machinery. After the forbidden symbols were exposed, after the lofty rituals of authority fractured under the weight of a random citizen's stumble, there was no going back to the carefully constructed pretense. The moment of revelatory failure dissolved all hierarchies, stripping every person present, the noble, the frantic priest, the skeptical alchemist, and the desperate pauper, of their perceived spiritual armor. Authority had been reduced to farce by a mere surge of steam. What remained was not sanctity, but the stark, wet reality of filth. The bathhouse, which moments before had been treated as a nexus point between life and death, suddenly reverted entirely to its base function, merely a container for human waste and bodily runoff. A collective gasp of realization swept through the steam-filled air. The grand designs for spiritual control were meaningless. The divine was simply mixed into the grime. An attendant, overwhelmed by the sudden chaos, and perhaps fearful of the remaining loose secrets, grabbed buckets and began moving toward the deepest drains. This was not a cleansing ceremony, but an immediate, frantic cleanup effort. The accumulated runoff, the residue of sin, the detritus of ritualistic desperation, the actual biological waste from days of concentrated panic needed to be disposed of instantly before it could reveal too much, before it could pollute or perhaps inspire further unwanted thought. Those gathered were forcibly ushered into a corner where a massive funnel drain stood open, beckoning the inevitable mess. They were told this final rinse was necessary, that they had participated in such an unnatural confluence of death and alleged purification that their physical bodies required to be washed clean of the stain, the figurative stain, echoing the exposed symbols on the wall. The process began with a rush of foul-smelling liquid, not scented oil or sacred river silt, but the unmistakable, brackish runoff water mixed with household grime. It was the literal residue of the city's confined existence and its panicked grappling with mortality. Priests who had moments ago dictated spiritual protocol were now splashed shoulder high by this muddy torrent. Nobles whose every gesture spoke of engineered piety found their fine robes soaked in indistinguishable filth. The alchemist who sought to analyze the sacred water sources was doused in a mere puddle of floor runoff. Even those who had watched the dead processed moments before felt the shocking physicality of this final baptism, a rinse that served only to remind them of the sheer messiness of their world. It was bitter and acrid, tasting of decay and damp stone. The purpose of this forced communal cleansing dissolved any pretense of a sacred boundary having been maintained. It was simply an unsanitary curtain call. This sudden descent into sheer physical filth marked the conclusive collapse of all esoteric meaning. All were meant to rinse together, anonymously mixed with sewage and steam condensate, their individual spiritual statuses temporarily equalized by the brute force of dirty water. The scattered mixture served as a potent, undeniable anti-ritual. It was the bathhouse, asserting its own common, mundane reality over the elaborate lies of theology or temporal power. As the initial flush subsided, leaving behind puddles that reflected the damp gloom and coated surfaces in an oily sheen, the participants found themselves standing on truly soiled ground, having been thoroughly rinsed of their elevated self-importance. They were merely wet and covered in the physical signs of struggle. The scum of soap residue mixed with plague dust and deep sewer runoff. The immediate threat of arrest or contagion was momentarily replaced by a profound sense of being exposed, both literally and spiritually, to nothing but dirty water. This sudden deflation left them vulnerable, unsettled, unable to resume their former roles or confidences. They waited in the damp silence following the great rinse, shells of people whose deepest secrets had been washed away with the foul runoff, leaving only a deep stain of confusion on the stone floor and an indelible memory of pure, disgusting reality. Days passed like a slurry of sewage and exhaustion. The fervor that had gripped the city, fueled by fear and desperate faith, finally drained away, leaving behind only a sticky residue of damp tile and forgotten sweat. What remained was not a holy nexus, but simply a public utility, stained deep with the memory of ritual transgressions. The surviving authorities moved through the bathhouse grounds with a hasty, grim efficiency. The grand charade had collapsed. The high drama of the supernatural exchange for silence had been undone by a burst of steam and a drunken stagger. Their task was now one of containment, an attempt to reclassify the impossible as merely practical. The order arrived from the municipal council. Cleanse the slate, stabilize the infrastructure, render the divine profane. The goal was simple enough on paper to make the bathhouse indistinguishable from any other bathhouse in Christendom, but the evidence of the preceding days refused to yield so easily. Where once steam vents had been viewed as mere architectural features distributing hot vapor, they were now perceived by the common folk with a terrible new understanding. They seemed to breathe. They exhaled not just steam, but residual memory. The air itself hung thick and sweet, smelling of blended oils and deep earth, a haunting perfume that did nothing to disguise the stink beneath. The custodians worked tirelessly, scrubbing the mosaic floors until their grout lines bled white dust, attempting to wash away every trace of what had transpired. The sacrificial tunics, the illicit pacts, the disturbing submergences. Yet, the grime was deeper than mere dirt. It seemed etched into the porous stone, layered with fear and the residue of profound confusion. The investigation, once scientific inquiry, had now morphed into a creeping unease among the laborers themselves. Alchemists' careful samples, which had revealed only plumbing discrepancies and basic chemical reactions, could no longer fully satisfy the populace. When the water drawn from the deepest drains tasted too suspiciously clean, or when the steam seemed to emanate not just from heat, but from some hidden depth, the locals remembered the desperate accusations, the warnings about souls marked by contaminated life water. The noble authority, stripped of its ritualistic power, retreated into a fragile pretense of normal governance. They spoke openly of plumbing upgrades and sanitation mandates, dismissing the visible scorch marks on the walls or the strange patches of vibrant mold growth as mere structural decay. But their words lacked conviction. They were merely echoing a dismissal they could no longer enforce. There was a specific drain near where the first rites had been performed that refused to be fully sealed, no matter how much cement was poured. It seemed the runoff continued, finding new, unseen paths through the bedrock. And in those drains, settled at the lowest point of the basin, lay remnants, small, inexplicable caches. Sometimes a piece of oil-stained cloth, other times just perfectly smooth river silt, dropped as if by an unobserved hand days prior. The scent was the worst offender. It wasn't simply the mixed odor of sewage and soap. It was a lingering, indefinable aroma that suggested boiling sin. The air tasted metallic, like blood mingled with steam. And everywhere, in the corners and along the damp lower walls, were symbols. Not the grand, carved forbidden signs exposed by the burst of steam, but tiny, almost incidental markings. A single etched spiral here, a clustered trinity there. They looked less like ritual graffiti and more like natural accretions, as if the passing currents themselves had inscribed them over centuries. The community's understanding of this massive public space was fundamentally altered. It ceased to be merely the place where bodies were scrubbed clean before entering society. It became something else entirely. A threshold, a nexus point caught between worlds. Each plume of steam that rose from the vents no longer whispered promises of cleanliness, but rather vague warnings of passage. The bathhouse had been irrevocably charged by the collision of plague panic, aristocratic power plays, pseudo-scientific investigation, and sheer human desperation. The boundary between the biological act of washing and the metaphysical crossing point was dissolved into a continuous, damp haze. Locals started moving with caution around the vents, no longer simply utilizing them for heat, but anticipating what might emerge from their plumes: a confused spirit, a misplaced soul, or perhaps just another reminder that in this place, death never truly ended. It